G'day humans, welcome to the safe space for dangerous ideas. Today your dangerous ideas, in conversation with me, Josh Sepps, for a special episode of Uncomfortable Conversations where we're doing a live Zoom and you get to ask the questions yourself. If you didn't know that this was happening, then you should be subscribed to Substack. You don't actually need to be a paid subscriber. You can just go to substack.com/uncomfortableconversations. Just click the free button, and on a free subscription, you will avail yourself of such opportunities as this, at least to tune in and join. Here we are. Look, I can see a video of myself. Hey, everybody. Just giving a little introductory spiel to people who are listening to the podcast version of this, and we'll hopefully get something out of your insightful questions and our delightful banter. I don't want this show to just be me talking with galaxy-brained individuals about some of the most important issues of our time. I also want to incorporate some kind of connection with the audience itself. I know lots of you have lots of interesting ideas, lots of interesting questions, so let's get stuck in and have a chat. As always, if you want to be alerted to watch these events live as they go out on Zoom, Uncomfortable Conversations is the place on Substack. That's substack.com/uncomfortableconversations. You don't need to pay in order to watch live. If you're a subscriber, you'll just receive email alerts about this and all kinds of other goodies. Let's get stuck in. Who have we got first? My trusty producer, Dave, is going to patch people through. So let's select somebody, Dave, and see how we go.
Josh, I wanted to gather your reaction to a line that I've been hearing in regards to violence against women in Australia. And I'm not going to colour it with any of my commentary to begin with, just to get your reaction.
Fabulous.
And the line is, the phrase that you see on placards and in the media is that men just need to do better. So that's the line, and I'm just looking for your reaction on it.
My initial reaction is laughter. Sorry, I don't mean to make light of it. For as background to this, for people who might be listening or watching abroad, there's currently a national conversation going on in Australia about domestic violence. The government will be holding a panel about this. The Prime Minister announced yesterday that he's committing almost $1 billion in funding for people to leave domestic violence situations. You're going to be able to get, I think, a $5,000 grant if you don't have any money and if you're in an abusive relationship. And they're also looking at cracking down on toxic masculinity online and age gating places, social media sites, so that you know that only grown-ups are seeing grown-up content. It's tricky, isn't it, Ryan? I mean, I'm inclined to ask you what your thoughts are. Is there a take buried in that innocuous question?
I mean, it is. If I'm going to be honest and a bit flippant about it, it's now that I've heard that line that I just need to do better, I won't go home and murder my family and children and commit suicide. Yeah,
it's good. I'm glad that we've had that clarified for us. Yeah, because I wasn't aware. It reminds me a little bit of like some neighborhoods in Sydney, many of which are the most multicultural and least racist neighborhoods in the world, have seen fit to use taxpayer funds to erect signs on the on the street signs saying "racism not welcome here," as if racists are wandering around going, "Oh, I assumed that racism was okay," and then they see the sign and go, "Oh, okay. If racism is not welcome, then maybe I shouldn't be racist." I mean, domestic violence is a huge problem. Like, as the Prime Minister pointed out, every 4 days a woman is killed by someone she knows. One death is too many. We need better resources for people to escape abusive relationships when they can't. And yet, like you, I do feel like you sort of want to win over the largest number of winnable people, don't you? So, I mean, you want the bulk of men to feel like they're not being looped in with pathological maniacs who commit violence against women. I mean, it is, you wouldn't know from the reporting that more than twice as many men are killed by men. Like, that's not a domestic violence question, but I think this conversation has spilled out well beyond domestic violence, so that now we're talking just about, what it's like to move through the world. And I add all of the necessary caveats and the throat clearing that I don't know what it's like to move through the world as a person surrounded by potential sexual predators who are larger and stronger than me. That's something that I will not experience, that women have to endure. But on the question of, like, breaking this down as if it were an easy cleavage between men and women, where there are men who are aggressors and women who are victims. Like, the reality is that no demographic is more dangerous than young males, mostly young straight males. And part of the project of civilization is to curtail and constrain the instincts of young men. And we only have to look at places where those constraints break down to see what happens. If you look at civil wars, it's always young men who are doing the worst shit. And if you look at, places where law and order breaks down, it's always young men who are doing terrible things. The kind of structures of modern civilization provide enough context for young men to have those passions, or even just if you look at, all male boarding schools and things like that. We've constructed systems and ways to try to contain that. And it strikes me that that cohort of people are extremely dangerous to women, and they're also extremely dangerous to other men. I mean, it's not a whataboutism move, I don't think, to say more than twice as many men are killed by men as women are killed by men. Therefore, the target should be the violent men, not the entire cohort of males. Like, I understand the instinct to get men talking to other men in ways that are more constructive and making domestic violence taboo. And that was probably a laudable goal in 1985. How many communities in 2024 of men are actually sitting around going, oh, just give her a bit of a slap about the face, she'll be all right? I don't know any men who speak that way. Maybe I'm like detached and ivory tower, but I think we've all basically got the memo that it's not on. So the people who are still doing it are a cohort of misfits and deranged people and psychopaths or whatever they might be. So yeah, men need to do better. I mean, it's sort of obvious, isn't it? Why don't you just say that murderers need to do better? Murderers need to not murder, unlike domestic violence.
I think that's the problem, Josh. Like, to your point, it paints this picture to people that men are on this sliding scale or spectrum from civilized man to somewhere between aggressive abuser and, at worst, the Bondi stabber, right? And I think it's this idea that we're all on this spectrum as men, and we're all white-knuckling through this world not to hurt people. And I think that's the dangerous message I feel that it sets up, right? I know it's not always at that space, and I support many things, but the people that really need to hear this message aren't going to be the ones that will listen to it, because there are other systemic things going on. There are mental conditions that need to be sorted out. There's trauma. And so I think it's a little bit misguided, and you end up alienating a lot of your would-be advocates.
Yeah, and yes, that's right. And that can also lead to more pernicious and toxic versions of masculinity coming to the fore. I mean, part of the problem is that, I do think part of the rise of the Andrew Tates of the world and like this extreme online sexism and misogyny is a backlash or a reaction to a sense that if you're a young guy who isn't very good at getting laid and isn't very good with social niceties and isn't a jock and doesn't know his place in the world, then receiving a barrage of criticism about your masculinity being inherently toxic or deranged, and you being a beneficiary of thousands of years of white male hegemony, is not terribly constructive, and probably leaves you more vulnerable to being taken advantage of by toxic figures online. I mean, part of my mission on this show, as you know, is like to try to create the largest possible sphere of mutual comprehension, so that we all feel like we're on the same team and that we're fighting the same enemies. And the enemy is violence. The enemy is male violence. I mean, I'm happy to frame it that way. The enemy is the unleashing of male violence on other people. But if you want to carve that off and diminish it, it would strike me as wise to have as many men on your side as you can. I mean, I think the other point that I would make here, Ryan, is that the rise in anxiety and depression and fear among young women, which I think you can put down to social media as much as anything, and to algorithms and to Instagram and so on, is something that is worth thinking about when we figure out how to talk about these issues as well, because we're already freaked out. all of us have experiences of knowing people who walk through the world in a state of victimization and fear instead of in a state of power and possibility. And if you wanted to create a narrative that was as corrosive as possible to young women's sense of self-determination and power, it would be a narrative in which they're constantly being harangued and under threat of violence from a universal cohort of equally intrinsically violent males. I mean, that would not be a good world to walk through. And if we regard it as a bad thing for parents to be hysterical and overprotective of their children and constantly worried about whether or not their children are going to be snatched when they're walking along the road by a pedophile in a white van or something, and if we recognize that, part of life is risk-taking, part of life is trying to moderate and conditionalize our credences, our possible beliefs against actual data and facts, then I'm reminded a little bit of the race riots in America in 2020, where you would cherry pick a single example of police brutality against a black person and then use that as a reason to essentially whip up media hysteria and instill fear in all black people, which is not to say that they're not disproportionately targets of violence. They may well be. And it's not to say that women aren't disproportionately targets of domestic violence specifically. They are. But they're not disproportionately targets of male violence, period. Males are the disproportionate targets of male violence. And if we want young women to walk with their heads up high, then it's probably good for us all to have an actual understanding of how severe the threat is and how real the threat is, versus one that's just whipped up by slogans and banners and placards saying men need to take more responsibility because all men are violent and all women are living in constant danger. Like, the statistics are bad, but they're also not that bad. I mean, I actually went back and looked at you could clip that and you say that I'm being some kind of men's rights, fascist for saying that. But just going off the data, the number of women killed in the last financial year was a little up from the year before, and there may be COVID reasons for that and whatever else, but it's the second lowest in 30 years. Like, the 1989 to 1990 financial year was the last time that it was this quote unquote good. Now, again, every single death is a tragedy, but if you're actually looking at the genuine risk that people face, if you're looking at police data, and I can accept that there are all kinds of caveats around that because maybe police data is underestimating it, but it's certainly not underestimating it today more than it was underestimating it in 1989 to 1990. The long-term trajectory is good, so how can we make it better, and how can we have as many allies as possible in that project, I think is
it's the problem with Hearts and Minds, isn't it, Josh, that you need this raw emotion to get people off their seat, to capture them, for the media to even pick things up. But the problem is when that anger and that frustration just attaches to the wrong thing. And not to take us off onto a tangent, but when it gets so bad that you can't even tell friend from foe, like the Albo situation at the protest, I think that's
just explain what happened with... So Albo is the Prime Minister of Australia, and he was at a protest, a women's march, and just explain to people who didn't see it what happened.
Yeah, that's right. So the Prime Minister was contacted by the organisers of the women's protest to speak, and initially the office said that he couldn't, but then he decided to walk and to march with the women to show support. And then there was a bit of a argy-bargy on whether he was able to talk at the time. And from what I saw on the recordings, there was a bit of, oh, should we let him talk? We'll ask the crowd. He got a little bit frustrated. So Anthony Albanese clearly got a bit frustrated at the situation. He said, I'm the PM, do you want me to speak or not? And so finally, when he came on the mic, he expressed that frustration and said that we wanted to talk, they wouldn't let us. At which point the organizer was very frustrated, said, that's a lie. I contacted you earlier, you said no. Obviously, Albo was talking about it right then and there. And she ended up getting very upset and crying. And there's been a huge backlash against Anthony Albanese for showing what has been described by the organizer as another example of male entitlement and exactly the problem.
Right. Okay. So yeah, him being mildly bitter about whether or not he, as the Prime Minister, is entitled to speak at a women's rally is the same is the same category of problem in the minds of some people as a person murdering their family. It's all just male. It's all just men being men. I mean, yeah, give me a break. Although I do suspect that once you're prime minister, you should probably not be bitter about stuff like that, and you should probably just get up there and say your thing. And there's no point in, as prime minister, being having thin skin. Ryan, thanks for the question. It's great to talk to you. Take care.
Hi, Josh. It's Tyrone here.
Hey, Tyrone. How you doing?
Good, thanks. Love the podcast.
Thank
great
you, mate.
to be here. My question is, in a world where we're becoming increasingly polarized, how do we have uncomfy conversations about important issues like energy policy? So at the moment in Australia, there's two really big kind of shit fights happening around energy policy. One is nuclear energy, and whether we need it in Australia or whether it should even just be legal. It's currently illegal in Australia. Yes, very crazy. And the other one is around environmental impacts of large-scale renewable energy projects. So in northern Queensland, the state that I live in, there's been a lot of pushback from environmentalists where remnant forest has been cleared for these large wind projects. And they're getting called fake environmentalists. They're a front group for the Liberal Party. And the same with nuclear. Like I've been a Greens Labor voter. I ran against Peter Dutton as a Greens candidate in 2013. And every time I bring up nuclear energy, it's like, oh, you're a Liberal shill, who's paying you, et cetera, et cetera. So, interested in your thoughts on how we have these conversations and do better as a society.
I mean, I don't know I don't know what the answer to the question about how we have the conversations is, because I'm doing my bit. But on the question of the ability to talk in a scientifically based way about energy policy, yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? The nuclear issue in the green space is fascinating, because when I talk to Greens now, and you can tell me if this is your experience. Mostly what I hear is actually, oh, look, it's too late for nuclear to be viable anyway, because it takes 20 years to build a reactor, and by then renewables are going to be the only game in town, so there's no point in talking about it now, which I find to be a little bit of a dodge, because if you're talking about the conversation, if you're having a meta conversation about the way that we have conversations about public policy and science, the response to that would be, well, where were you 20 years ago when we could have been building the nuclear reactors that would now be providing baseload power and enable us to get rid of coal altogether? So it's all very well to say it's too late now, but I mean, you would be critical of a conservative who'd been stonewalling on action against climate change, for example, for 30 or 40 years, and just now was saying, oh, look, it's too late for us to do anything about it. You'd say, well, yeah, but where were you? You weren't in favor. You were trying to block renewables in the 1990s when it would have been, when that was the time to do it. And similarly, the same criticism can be made of the left on nuclear. It may be the case. I want to do a whole deep dive on nuclear, really, because I suspect that it's probably the case that it is too late, and that by the time you actually got the reactors up in the 2040s and 2050s, renewables are just going to be so good. And if we electrify everything, if we go the kind of Saul Griffith route and rapidly electrify our homes and have as many solar panels as we can on roofs, and have as much electric vehicle uptake as we can, then it may be the case that solar and wind and energy storage like hydro storage or battery storage are good enough that you don't need nuclear to provide baseload power by the time you're in the 2040s and 2050s. But as I think you're alluding to, that should be a conversation that's had on its merits, and that's had on the basis of the science and the cost per kilowatt hour, and our willingness to, what risks we're willing to tolerate. And there's a lot of fuzzy thinking.
Yeah, the it's too late argument is one that they're making the same argument. Oh, it'll take 10, 15 years. Is the same argument they were making 10, 15 years ago. We could have nuclear running right now. I just don't think that's a good enough argument to maintain a ban on clean energy. I also think that, the future is long. People think we've only got 10 years, but really we've got all of the remaining human history that we need to provide clean energy for. So to limit ourselves is potentially problematic.
And I mean, the other thing, Tyrone, is like if you build it, then you can use it or not use it, as the case may be. It's not like you're required to use it forever just because you built it. But if you want to do now the things that you will want to have done, so that if you need them, you won't not have done them, then you might as well be doing all the things now that you might want to have done by the time the 2040s or 2050s come around. So I don't know why. But when you say that nuclear is banned, I mean, isn't that a bit of a pejorative? You're putting spin on that. I mean, there are currently no licenses being issued for nuclear power reactors to be built in Australia, but energy is energy is always going to be planned from on top, isn't it?
It's actually illegal in Australia. So
I can't build a nuclear reactor, but I'd need to get a permit to build a coal-fired power plant as well, wouldn't I? It's just the fact that they would issue the permit potentially for the coal-fired power plant, but not for the nuclear.
The federal environmental minister can't legally approve a nuclear reactor. It's banned in the EPBC Act from 1998. So John Howard had to do a deal with the Democrats and the Greens to get the Lucas Heights reactor built, the current Opal reactor, which provides medical isotopes for, cancer treatments. So as a deal to get that over the line in the late 90s, he slipped in this amendment that he wouldn't approve nuclear power. So it's actually been illegal for the last 25 years.
I see. So what you mean is there's actually a piece of legislation that says that even if the government of the day wants to approve it, the executive branch can't do it. It would have to go through. They'd have to pass a bill to undo the other law.
Yeah, that's right. And big energy companies are saying we're not even looking at nuclear energy because why would we? Our shareholders would not be happy if we were spending money on investigating an energy source that's actually illegal.
Yeah, right.
So
right.
Just lifting the ban would allow us to have a conversation. And this is one of the arguments that groups like the Climate Council are saying is, it's illegal. I'm like, yeah, marriage equality used to be illegal too, but it was stupid and unjust. So we changed the law. Like, just because something's illegal doesn't mean that it's bad. So this is a really kind of silly argument that a lot of green groups are making, unfortunately.
What do you make of the waste argument and the fact that you're basically bequeathing to generations in 10,000 years who may be existing without our scientific knowledge? We may have a societal collapse. You can imagine a civilizational collapse. You can imagine like hunter-gatherers coming back and stumbling upon all this radioactive crap that we've pushed out and buried. How do you communicate to civilizations tens of thousands of years in the future that they shouldn't touch this stuff?
Yeah, that's a great question, Josh. And I think if civilization collapsed, we've got probably bigger issues on our hands than small amounts of radioactive material sitting around safely stored in concrete and steel canisters. And also, it's not tens of thousands of years before this stuff is relatively benign. You're looking at between 500 and 1,000 years, and this stuff returns to a level that's similar to the background radiation, the mine that it came from. But better yet, we can reprocess and recycle this stuff. So, for instance, all the spent nuclear fuel sitting around in the UK could be reprocessed and power the UK for 500 years, just with what's been already mined. So we wouldn't have to mine anything more. We just reprocess this stuff. Obviously, there's challenges to that as well, but I think, there's solutions available if we're willing to have the conversations about how we do these things. If you just shut it down it's a toxic mess, we're going to kill millions of people for 100,000 years, then you don't allow yourself to ask these questions.
And Tyrone, is part of the breakdown in conversation on the green side, from your perspective, a result of like the kind of general ideology of people who place themselves in that movement? Because you mentioned the wind farms and the chopping down of trees, or it strikes me that the easiest path out of the climate crisis, the crisis of what I like to call of climate chaos, which I think is just an easier way of articulating to people that it's going to be really expensive and an enormous hassle to constantly be sitting on the tarmac while your plane is delayed because there are too many thunderstorms, and for everything to always be delayed and expensive, and have to or there always to be ash in the air every summer because of bushfires, and for homes to have to move back from the water because the storm surges are more frequent. Like, it's going to be at the at best case scenario, it's going to be really annoying and really costly to live through the next half century or so. And the easiest way out of that probably is for us all to have a slightly techno-utopian, optimistic, market-oriented path out of this, where we can put in place things like carbon taxes and ways to incorporate the negative externalities of climate gases into the economy as it stands, rather than to do what many people on the green left would like to do, which I think is embrace an anti-market mindset, an anti-growth mindset. I mean, you can have a whole conversation about the sustainability of growth, but for in the here and now, when we find ourselves in an emergency, you use the tools that you've got, and the tools that we currently have are ones that are based around market capitalism and social democracy. So is part of the disconnect in having conversations about this that you're talking with people who are fundamentally ideologically opposed to the system that we live in and want bigger reform than just solving the climate crisis?
Yeah, that's a good question, Josh. I think some of it is just an opposition to capitalism, and nuclear is seen as part of capitalism. Certainly 10 years ago, when I was advocating for 100% renewable vision, I didn't really conceptualize in my head what that would look like in reality. Wind turbines, plastered across every beautiful natural vista that we can think of. And I was picturing this green utopia, not an industrialization of our natural landscapes. And I've come to oppose some of those projects because I know that there is this alternative, that if we include nuclear energy, we can have a smaller land use footprint and reduce some of the environmental impacts of that. One of the big pushbacks I get from the green movement is that, nuclear is just an excuse to continue mining. And it's like, well, where do you think the resources for wind and solar come from? They're mined out of the ground as well. These things don't just fall like manna from heaven onto the landscape. They're built in China, where there's these huge coal power stations powering these big silicon plants that are making the solar panels. So I think there's a disconnect in people's minds about what it's really going to take to do this clean energy transition and what they think that they want. And
yeah.
I'll just also say that within the green movement, it's really interesting when I speak to younger Green Party members especially, is they go, yeah, we know the policy on nuclear is dumb, but if we were to change the policy, it'd break the hearts of all the older generation in the party who, built this movement off the back of the anti-nuclear movement. And they're the ones with all the money. So we can't piss them off too much.
Fascinating. And they probably have understandable emotional reasons for being opposed to nuclear, because they lived through an era of Chernobyl, and they lived through an era of the Cold War and of the Cuban Missile Crisis maybe, and whatever. Yes, they're not. Absolutely. If you were inheriting nuclear technology as it starts now and starting from a base zero right now, you'd probably evaluate it more favorably than you would if you're inheriting all of those tragedies, because the technology is better and because our political systems are better. Tyrone, thanks. Great to talk to you. Thanks for chiming in.
Thanks, Josh.
Have a good one. And just a reminder that if you want to be alerted to the next time we do one of these, so that you can join us live, substack.com/uncomfortable conversations. You can either have a paid subscription or a free subscription. Either way, you get to watch along and you get to be alerted to events like this and lots of other great stuff via email. Charles, we got you now.
Fantastic. Thank you for doing such a commendable job on your discussions on what's going on in Israel and Gaza. With that in mind, I wanted to ask the question, understand your thoughts on what's going on with first of all, the actual university campuses around the world that are staging the sit-ins and the protests against the war. And secondly, having seen what happened currently in Colombia, where some of these protesters were arrested, what do you think the backlash is going to be going forward with all of it?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the first thing I would say is young people are allowed to be stupid, and I was stupid when I was in university as well, and so I give a fairly wide berth to what's happening on campus in terms of the people who are doing the protesting. Now, of course, there's going to be fringe elements there who are genuinely anti-Semitic or who are genocidal even, but I think the general thrust of student protests is that this is not just about Gaza, and this is not just about Israel. This is about justice. This is about colonialism. This is about international politics. This is, they see this battle, rightly or wrongly, wrongly in my view, as being tied up with broader features of a world that has been ruled for too long by white men with bombs, and not by the people who have a right to live freely in the places where their grandparents came from. Now, all of that is complicated and muddied and messy, and many of these people lack a proper historical context for why the Palestinian situation is as grave as it is. Many of them absolve Arab states too freely. Many of them absolve basically anyone but the Jews for the scenario that we find ourselves in. But what do university campuses do? I guess the thing that's been infuriating about the response of universities so far, really ever since October 7th, has been the double standard that they obviously have towards Jews. It reminds me of David Baddiel, who I had on the podcast, the English comic who's written a book called Jews Don't Count. And I'd encourage people to listen to that episode of the podcast, because David's very articulate, and his point in Jews Don't Count is just that over the past decade or so, we've had a reckoning, a social justice reckoning, in which we now understand that minorities get to decide how they want to be treated and how the majority gets to speak to them. We don't get to use sexist language to a woman, and when she objects, just say, "Oh, lighten up. I didn't mean I was sexist. I was just making a joke, love." And we don't get to use racialized language about black people and then say, "Oh, no, but I didn't use the N-word, or I wasn't actually being racist." We have to listen to the woman, and we have to listen to the person of color about the way that we speak, about the microaggressions that they're feeling. And that overall is, I think, a welcome change. It's made us more sensitive. It can go too far, but it's good to be mindful of the impact that we're having. Baddiel's point is that the only minority who doesn't get that right to talk about how they want to be treated and spoken about is the Jews. The Jews aren't a real minority. They're too wealthy. They're too conniving. They're too slimy, they're too powerful, they're too sniveling at the same time. And so when you talk about how Gaza just goes to prove that there's, that Zionists have a bloodlust and love the blood of Palestinian babies, if a Jew says, sounds a little bit like historical anti-Semitism, it seems to be totally fine for the protester to say, no, I'd used the word Zionist. I didn't actually say Jew, so I'm not talking about Jews. There's nothing anti-Semitic about it because some Jews are also anti-Zionists. Therefore, I've got a get-out-of-jail-free card, and you can't criticize me for it. Like, in no other social justice scenario do we allow the majority group to say, no, I'm gonna deafen myself and blind myself to the concerns that I'm being told a persecuted minority has, because I assert that I didn't mean it in a way that was offensive, and they're just being oversensitive. And so what I think the weird thing about the whole university uprising is that these are bastions of that social justice orthodoxy, of that dogma, of that ethos. And if it were the case that these protesters were there and they were MAGA, Make America Great Again types who were protesting against, Black Lives Matter, does anyone doubt that they would have been moved out on day one I mean, they wouldn't have been able to say, oh, our words aren't intended to be genocidal against blacks, therefore you should allow us to protest. The university would have seen that black people felt threatened by the presence of those protests, and it wouldn't have become a free speech issue. They would have just been moved along. Now, if you have protesters against Israel who are chanting from the river to the sea, and they're dredging up very traditional old anti-Jewish tropes, and just to clarify for people who think there's something innocuous about from the river to the sea, many Jewish people feel that is basically saying that there should be an Arab Palestinian state on the land where Israel currently is, not just in the occupied territories, but in actual Israel. So the question of what happens to the Jews, do they get put on trains? Do they get shipped out on boats? Do they get slaughtered? Or do they get to live happily, as many Palestinian activists like to say, happily alongside the Palestinians in this future Arab state that's not going to be at all dysfunctional and will respect the rights of Jews and gays and women, like all those other great Arab majority, Muslim majority states that we see around the world. So if there's a genocidal overtone or a slightly threatening tone or intent in, quasi-violent protests that are chanting about Zionist bloodlust and from the river to the sea, it's galling that university administrators don't see that as the same kind of intimidation as they would immediately recognize if it was Make America Great Again types talking about any other minority. Coming back to Badil's point, Jews don't count as a minority. Jews don't count as a group of people who can have legitimate concerns, even when it reaches the stage, as it did in Colombia, that Jewish students and teachers and professors were being told that they should stay home because the police couldn't guarantee their safety. You're still quibbling about how many angels fit on the head of a pin and what is free speech and how much free speech there should be. These are questions that would not arise were it any other minority being demonized. And I just feel terribly sad that world Jewry has been forced to hitch its wagon to a noxious right-wing government in Israel. I don't think that what's going on in Gaza is morally acceptable. There has to be a better way. There's responsibility and culpability on both sides here. I mean, the extreme right-wing provocations of the Netanyahu government for 15 plus years have contributed to the situation that Israel finds itself in. And I'm frankly resentful and furious that we have to sit here beholden as Jews to what the Israeli government does, expected to answer for it, expected to be caught up as collateral damage in its intransigence and its aggression. But I don't see, that's a very long way of answering your question, Charles, but I don't see a way out of this until there is some kind of a long-term resolution to the problem of Palestine and Israel. I just wish that people had cooler and calmer heads and that there was more consistency about the way that we expect protests to be conducted and the legitimacy of targeting individual minority groups. Thanks, Charles. Good to talk to you. Let's go on to our next guest on this live Zoom. Oh, Ryan's back. Hey, Ryan.
I'm back, I think, just to provide a bit of comedic relief.
Okay, good. Go. I'm always appreciate comedic relief.
So I've been actually always very interested in things to do with race and ethnicity.
Yeah.
And recently, we got the whole family to do one of those DNA ethnicity tests.
Oh, yeah.
And I won't go into my one, but was very surprising too. But my wife actually came back as 10% Ashkenazi Jew, which was a total mystery. And my question to you is, does that mean that we technically have the right to return to Israel? And more importantly, do my kids have to serve in the IDF?
That is, don't worry. I think you're fine. I think you're off the hook. I believe that you have to have one grandparent to be able to go to one Jewish grandparent. So if she's 1/10, no, she doesn't cut it. Maybe Hitler would still kill her. I don't know. What were the rules back then? So you might sneak through on that technicality, but I don't think. Yeah, she has brown eyes. Actually, what ethnicity did she think she was?
Convict, Australian.
Right. Fascinating.
But there was a lot in there. But it raises hidden in that story raises a bigger question about just what we think we are, and we're obviously a lot more diverse than we identify with. And, you know, it really talks to this stuff around even something like The Voice, to say, what percentage of you does it have to reach this threshold before you can identify as someone, or you can choose to find your culture or whatever it may be? And it's fascinating to me.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a dramatic increase in the number of Indigenous Australians over the past decade or so, which is interesting, of people identifying as that, because, I mean, I guess it makes sense that if socially there's a group that is maligned and disadvantaged, then you wouldn't do much work in trying to figure out whether or not you belonged to that group. But then if the narrative flips and that group becomes respected as a repository of all wisdom and decency in a white supremacist world, in a post-colonial world, then maybe you would like start digging around and go, you know what? I think Aunt Bertha said that one of her great-grandparents was slightly Indigenous. Therefore, I'm going to find my power as a proud Wiradjuri man, or whatever it might be. But yeah, which is not necessarily to diminish it. I mean, our identities are always stitched together through a bunch of different things, right? It's not, I don't think it's illegitimate to go, you know what? I'm actually a descendant of King Henry VII, which I am. And then maybe I focus a little bit more on that than on the loser alcoholic ancestor who I might want to downplay. So I think we all play a bit of that game. But yeah, that's interesting. Did you find out anything interesting about yourself?
I did, actually. My whole life, I've been told I come across very Eurasian. So for people listening, I of Chinese heritage, and or Asian heritage rather. And my test came back. I was expecting it to be 90% Asian ethnicity and maybe a splash of something else, but it came back 50% Iberian. So, ole. And I have no idea what that means, whether I'm adopted or some baby did a bad thing. But yeah.
Wait, how much was there? Was there any Chinese?
Yeah, so it was about 50% Iberian, which is Spanish, and 10% South American and things, and Italian. And then the rest was from the Asian culture.
Interesting. Oh, fascinating. Don't forget the Portuguese. You might be Portuguese. They're Iberian as well.
Well, that's right. The empire, right?
Yeah, exactly. Thanks, Ryan. Good to talk to you again. Florian, is it?
I was a subscriber, but I didn't really see anything till like 20 minutes ago. So
great. Welcome. That's the point. Live. Jump in.
Yeah. I don't know. This might have come up earlier, but I have a question about respecting cultures. So there's certain kind of okay, well, we should respect this culture. We should respect that culture. But what is it if cultures have some element that we kind of fundamentally disagree with, in the sense that they're doing something that might kind of be contrary to what we think is right or wrong? I mean, this goes very small. I mean, obviously this is not a huge kind of thing, but eating dogs is, but one culture might kind of say that fine, that's perfectly fine. Another culture is the yikes, how on earth can you do that? Or kind of if you go higher, it's polygamy. It's if you have that in arranged marriage in one culture might be perfect acceptable, in another culture it is obviously not. And so how do we, if we are expected to kind of respect cultures in kind of context, then how do we deal with the fact that those cultures might do something that is essentially commonly seen within a country as no, this is not right, this is not what we should be doing? So how do you...
I mean, doesn't it matter, Florian, whether or not the act is taboo simply because we've decided it's taboo versus whether or not the act is taboo because there are legitimate, rational reasons for its being taboo? And in other words, it causes actual harm to people. So the examples you gave, eating dogs, I'm a big fan of eating dogs. I think if you're going to eat a pig, you should be able to eat a dog. I've eaten dog in Southeast Asia. Sorry, Fido. I respect vegans for their consistency. I don't really respect people who will think that there's something noble about not eating a dog, but will unthinkingly participate in the torture and slaughter of millions of other sentient creatures, right, without a care in the world. So in that respect, I'd be okay, go for it. Eat your dogs. If you're a, Vietnamese Australian or something, and eat your dogs.
It's just more probably that's more a cultural sentiment.
But similarly, but I mean, I think where your question reaches its most sort of controversial or provocative endpoint, which is worth talking about, is like, what if there is a deeply sexist or homophobic subculture that's being imported, right? And you have communities where we as white people who are hyper-conscious and hypersensitive of our own white privilege, we have an instinct, a laudable instinct, to try to be as inclusive as possible towards minority cultures, especially if they're brown-skinned minority cultures coming from shittier places than we had the good fortune to be born into. Then we try to sort of take a hands-off approach to that. And yet, inside those subcultures, there can be brutalities that we would never accept if they were done on a widespread scale. That may be intense homophobia towards children who are trying to come out as gay. It may be a woman's place is in the home, kind of highly regressive models of sexism. It may be, veiling women. And we sort of struggle with, okay, you want to empower women, for example, in Muslim Australian communities to feel like there's no taboo around wearing a burqa or a niqab. If they want to, if they find empowerment in that, freely chosen, great, go for it. And yet it's hard to disentangle that from the fact that they would probably face exclusion, expulsion, and total socio-cultural annihilation from their peers and their husband and their parents if they declined to dress that way. So how do we, as the host society, without being condescending or patronizing, try to empower the minority within the minority? And, the smallest minority is always the individual. How do we empower the individual and the sub-minority to assert themselves against the larger minority, so that we're not just playing a game of giving a microphone to the loudest spoken representative of that community to tell us that everything's hunky-dory and there's nothing to see here and nothing to worry about, as they go about peddling norms that would not be acceptable in our liberal democratic system. I don't know the answer to that. My instinct and my hope is that it just fades away as generations evolve. Like the first generation of traumatized Lebanese refugees who come from the Lebanese civil war in the 1980s behave a certain way, but by the 2020s, their children and grandchildren are behaving differently. And you try to set up the norms of like, this is what we all have to agree to. You don't have to agree not to eat dog, and you don't have to agree that there's no parental input into your choice of a partner if you come from a place where arranged marriages are perfectly normal and you're willing to participate in that system. But when it comes to, I don't know, genital mutilation or, the suppression of people's sexuality or the denigration of people on the basis of their sex or gender, then you draw a line in the sand and say everybody in Australia or everybody in a Western liberal society has to subscribe to these core principles if you're going to live here. Is that a distinction that resonates?
Could I ask, do you make a distinction between respecting a culture and tolerating a culture? The sense saying, if I expect it to be respecting something, I'm essentially expecting to be endorsing it.
Yeah, right.
If I'm tolerating it, I can think that you're wrong, as in this is not something you should be doing, but I can tolerate that you are doing this or that you think this is right. We might not allow you to do it here, if you are basically in that culture, but I can tolerate that you think that is what should be done.
Yeah, that's interesting. Sometimes when I've said in the past that one of the key principles of a liberal democracy is tolerance, people hear that as being pejorative and say, I don't want to merely tolerate people. I want to respect people and uplift them and empower them. I don't use tolerance to mean I merely tolerate your existence grudgingly. I just use it as a neutral term to say I'm not going to get involved in your affairs. And I think you're right that I shouldn't need to respect your silly religion or your backward way of doing things from my perspective. But I do regard it as being valuable and important that I tolerate it, not in a bad way of I have to put up with it, but in a sort of meta-respectful way of saying, I'm drawing a line around what is private for me and what is private for you, and you can have your own existence and you can live that way, and I don't need to give it a moral valence one way or another, as long as you're not breaking any laws or you're not suppressing anybody or causing harm to anybody. That's fine. Yes, I think you're right that tolerance is the correct approach, not phony respect.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks, Florian. Okay, we're getting to the end of an hour now. So if there's anyone else, we can, let's see if there's one last person.
Can I just give one departing message to Florian?
Please, Ryan.
Florian, if your question is a polite way of saying, should you tolerate, and I'll pick on my own race, because Asian culture should tolerate something that is kind of rude or inconveniencing other people, the answer is no. Don't fall into that trap. And I've been through many examples of running into that from Asian culture. We had a classic one the other week of an Asian lady in our local shopping center reserving a car park by standing in it. And I was talking to lots of friends before, my white friends, and they're like, oh no, you gotta be respectful because in China and other places, this is fair game and she may not know. And you talk to all my Asian family and friends and they're like, oh, she's being so rude. She knows she's being rude and she's taking advantage of people. So I think...
But wait a second, that's not racialized at all, Ryan. I've seen so many white people do that. I've seen so many fancy women in the eastern suburbs of Sydney in little skirts that are too short with their duck lips full of lip filler and their Botoxed eyes, like standing there on their phone in a car spot waiting for somebody to come.
Well, the circles we run in, Josh. But I think, like, for example, in Malaysia, it is there's a double parking culture. So you can go nip into the shops, you get back and you find out there's a car literally parked side by side and you have to just lean on the horn. So it's those kind of things, those etiquette style things that I'm talking about. Florian, don't be afraid to call those out.
No. So no, it was more, the background was like the more like institutional priorities. Well, like if you have a setting where like the institution says, oh, we are supposed to like, we basically said like the institution requires you to respect a culture. Again, it's like I don't want to go into too much individual detail of like where it comes from at the moment, but
you're going to out yourself and get fired, Florian, for your unwillingness to respect the barbaric cultures that are being foisted on you by your employer.
But it was essentially getting that kind of like setting where somebody says like, where this is where the difference between respect and tolerance. Well, like I'm perfectly happy that like if basically I'm expected to tolerate other cultures, but essentially it's like at what point does someone impose on you something by saying like, by respecting this culture, you therefore have to agree to this, and this kind of like position. And that probably was more like, but anyways, it's like it is and say like I actually at some point really would like to try dog, but I have.
It's not great, I got to say. Reporting back from the front lines, I've had better meats than dog. Thanks Ryan for conversing with Florian and actually getting a back and forth. That's nice for all of us to be able to talk to each other and have it not just be a one-way street. I'm gonna love you and leave you and go and have some dog for lunch, and I give you permission to be as racist as you want to towards any Chinese person who's reserving a car spot unjustifiably. That's a crime we don't tolerate here in this civilized land of Australia. Thanks so much for being part of the conversation. We'll see you next time on Uncomfortable Conversations.